real quick, I want to give you guys my opinions on receivers versus processors, separates versus receivers. Let's go through some of the receivers that I have and processors or whatever. So I've had a Yamaha A2A. I just sold that one, and that's got the Yapo room correction. Not really that good. Then Denon 940, and I moved from that to Denon 3800H. I got an Onkyo RZ50 in a room that I kind of listen to music with some Kef LS50 metas. I've got I moved from the Denon 3800H to a Marantz Cinema 50. You know, I just like the way the Marantz looked. It was a little bit more musical. I listened to it, so I went for the Cinema 50 route. Then I ended up selling the Cinema 50. I have Anthem MRX 1140. That is a receiver from Anthem's line. It's like the top of the line receiver through Anthem. And then, you know, I started hearing people say, oh, separates is better. Separates is better. So I ended up getting an Anthem AVM 90, right? I skipped this Anthem AVM 70 and I went for the top of the line, which is the Anthem AVM 90, right? And some people, you know, they question, should I get separates or should I stick with a receiver? I say a lot of this depends, one, on your budget, right? Because when you go the separates route, it can get very expensive. You have to buy amps to power each channel, you know, so you may have to get multiple different amps, you know, because some amps may have 3 channels, you know, that it could drive. Some of them may have 5 channels it could drive. Some of them have 7 channels it could drive. You know, it just depends, you know, how much power you want, like what your speakers are rated at. Are they efficient? Are they inefficient speakers? Do they need a lot of power? You know, chances are if they need a ton of power, you're more than likely going to have more amps, right? Because you're going to, you know, most amps that drive fewer channels generally have more power, at least from what I've come across, right? So it's going to cost, you know, more in amplification. You're going to have more amps to power all of your speakers. So that's going to be, you know, part of the equation. Another thing is, you know, room. Do you have room to put all of your amps, you know, to power your processor? So not only do you have your amps, you got your processor, then you may have your 4K Blu-ray player, maybe your Zydu player, your Doom player, whatever. You have to have a place to put everything. Whereas like a receiver, the amplification is built into the receiver, so you don't have to have a ton of different amps to power or drive your unit, you know? So that is a plus in terms of what's, you know, you will get if you go with the receiver route. And then you've got the processor, which is going to just, you know, have a lot more into it. Now, positives versus negatives. What did I experience moving from an Anthem Anthem MRX 1140, which I still have in one room, Anthem MRX 1140 receiver to an Anthem AVM 90 processor? What did I see? First of all, convenience dropped off, right? So like I said, you have to have amplification to power each channel on the separates. So I had to figure out which amps did I like. You know, I had to listen to different things to see which is going to give me a decent sound signature that I would like. I ended up going with the Emotiva amplifiers for the AVM 90 because I liked them. I thought they were pretty, you know, efficient, not much distortion. I like the sound signature. Wasn't too warm, you know. It was kind of like a kind of a cooler sound signature. You know, it still was dynamic when it needed to be, you know, in terms of power being delivered to the speakers. I liked it, so I went ahead and went with the Emotiva amps for the AVM 90. A lot of people say, oh, go with Parasound and all of that. And I listen to the Parasound, and some people love the Parasound. I kind of just didn't really care for the way the Parasound sounded. You know, honestly, I didn't like the way it looked, and I didn't really care for how it sounded. It sounded decent, you know, like the signature that it gave you is like kind of almost like a warmer signature, like a deeper, like a warmer tone. But I didn't like it, and I didn't like the way it looked. I didn't like the way it looked in my rack, you know, so I went ahead and went with the Emotivas. Now, in terms of, you know, did I hear a big difference in sound with moving from the MRX 1140 to the AVM 90 separates processor? Yes, I did. First of all, when you look at separates, you're going to have So in a receiver, you're gonna have the amplifier, which I think Anthem puts a pretty good amplifier in their receivers. It's got a toroidal transformer. It's got, I think, 140 watts per channel with 2 channels driven. And it's got like another section of where it's got an amp to power like the height speakers and all of that. Like, so I think they've got pretty good, amplifier built into it. It's got amp matrixing, so if you're not using a channel, you can use the power from another channel to hook up into a speaker to biamp it. And like, it's got a lot that it can do, right? So, but with a processor unit, you're gonna have better circuitry, right? You're gonna have better transistors, better resistors and transistors. You're gonna have, a shorter travel path, in between, like at least with the Avium 90, it's like a shorter travel path for everything to go through, to be able to reproduce the sound. So, in essence, it's going to sound a little bit better, right? And then you got better DACs that are going to be in a separate processor than a receiver, right? So they're going to spend most of the money research and R&D and putting the best components inside the processor, because now they're going to utilize all that space to give it more of the best of what it can do. Whereas like the receiver, they're just trying to get it to, yes, sound good, but be able to do everything, And one thing I do like about the Anthems, their receivers, is that they use, I think, 5-volt pre-outs for their, if you want to run like external amps, so you can actually utilize all of the amplifier that you use if you choose to use external amplifiers with the receiver version of the MRX 1140. So that is really cool, because a lot of receivers do not do that. Like, they really skimp on the volts, and that ends up being an issue. But as far as receivers versus processors, the difference that I heard, right, is that there was a clearer separation in sound layers. So like if you've ever mixed music, or let's just say you've got 4 audio tracks, right? Or make it a little bit more complicated, whatever. So you got 7 audio tracks. Each track's got a different sound, right? You might have a vocal, you might have an effect, you might have, like just, you might hear a pin in the background, like pin dropping in the background. You might hear a can being knocked over in the background. Another track, you might have another effect. You got like 7 different layers, right? And 1 second sound, 1 to 2 second sounds, right? You got 7 different layers. On the Anthem MRX 1140, I think it did better than the Cinema 50 receiver, right? And so the MRX 1140 receiver was able to separate the sounds decently, so you can hear most of the layers of the 7 layers within the 2 seconds. You can hear most of the layers, right? And a movie track, right? Whereas like the Cinema 50, the Marantz, everything was kind of like squashed together a little bit. Sounded good, but it was like squashed together. The Anthem was able to separate a little bit better. Now, when I moved to the separates processor, the Anthem Avium 90, I can hear each distinct layer clearly. Right, so even when the pin is dropping, when the effect is added, because people, when they're making a movie, the sound engineer has to add everything that you're seeing. Like that's not in the audio when it's being recorded. Like they primarily just record the vocals. They come in and they, I've been in movies before, and I've seen like them mixing. So, they basically just add all of those effects. With the Avium 90, you can hear all of the effects clearly, right? So it's like you hear the can, you hear the pin drop pushed forward, whereas you can hear the pin drop on the MRX 1140 receiver. You can faintly hear it, but it's pushed forward on the processor, so it's just clearly distinct, right? Part of it is, like I said, you got better resistors, capacitors, better circuitry, better, I think it's got I think Saber DACs, if I'm not mistaken, on the Avium 90, better DACs, so that is, helping to reproduce the sound a little bit better. So you hear all of the 7 layers of sound with the processor, right? So is it worth it? When you have to ask yourself, what are you looking for? Also, what kind of speakers do you have? Do you have revealing speakers? Because sometimes you can have speakers that may be a little compressed sounding, they may not be as revealing, and you can put a processor, a separate processor, run it, and then run it through speakers that are not like really built to be super revealing, and then it's kind of like, let me give you an analogy. Like, you've got a souped up V12, right, running on an 8-cylinder manifold, right? Well, you should have like an 8-cylinder, a V12 manifold, but instead you got like an 8-cylinder manifold. So it's like, a lot of that is not coming through to the exhaust, you know what I'm saying, to be put out, you know what I mean? So it's like, if you're a car guy, you might know what I'm saying, maybe not, I don't know, but it's like, it's a lot of power, horsepower, but it's not being like utilized properly. You know what I mean? So it's like, it depends on the speakers and everything. If you got pretty decent speakers, and I'm not saying you got to have $20,000, $30,000 speakers, you could have some Polk R700 speakers, and they're pretty decent. You can have some Martin Logan speakers. They're like really good. It just depends on, you can have some Kev speakers, and they may not be as revealing, but, they can fan the sound out like pretty well, and you can still hear like some distinct layers of sound. This depends on what kind of speakers you got. If you got decent speakers, you can hear more with the AVM 90. One thing that I thought was cool about the AVM 90 versus the MRX 1140 receiver, right? The receiver, yeah, you can listen to music, whatever, right? I can listen to music through my Anki RZ50, you know what I mean? Or listen to it to the MRX 1140. But when I listen to music through the AVM 90, which is the processor, separates processor, you hear everything in the music track, you know what I mean? Whereas like the Anthem 1140 receiver, you hear it, but it's not as clear, it's not as defined, it's not as holographic that you get with the AVM 90. So a lot of this is going to be depending on your gear. I would say, for the enthusiasts out there, make sure you have the proper speakers that you want. Also make sure your room, I feel like having your room, have the proper treatment is better than what, a lot of components can give you, right? Because you can make a receiver sound incredible if you have the room treated appropriately, and then you also got to look at which, you can get a separates processor like a Marantz, one of them, or a receiver like a Marantz, just depending on what you get. But if the room's not properly treated, are you really gonna reap a lot of those benefits? It's something that you have to ask. So that, like, if you're looking for a separates processor and you feel like that's where you're at, you got the room treated, then, maybe you can start talking about that, you know what I mean? And thinking about it. Is it a big trade-off? Or I should say, is it really a night and day difference, a processor versus a receiver? Not to most people, because I can have my girl come in and listen to both, and on first listen, she really can't tell. But, but it also depends, because the Anthem's got a really great receiver, right? But then if I point certain things out, like if we watch Ghost in the Shell, when Scarlett Johansson in the beginning of the movie, and she's on a building, right? And they've got, I think, an HVAC system has got a fan, it's like spinning. On the receiver, it's spinning, like you can hear it spinning a little bit, but it's so much other stuff going on, you don't really pay attention to it. On the processor, the separates processor, the fan is spinning and it's pushed into your, pushed forward. So it's kind of hard not to notice it, and like when Scarlett Johansson, she finally goes into the building and she starts, having like a shootout in the building, like with the people or whatever, the bullet casings dropping, the projectiles, you hear them clearly and super forward, you know, like to where it's not, you know, on the receiver, you kind of hear it, you know what I mean? But, you know, not really paying attention to it. On the processor, it's right up in your face. Like, it's like you hear each projectile falling and hitting the floor. Like, the best way I could describe it, if you're watching John Wick and he's having a shootout, you know, I think it was John Wick 4, right? He's in like some house or whatever, and you know, he's got like I think he's got the shot. Somebody's got a shotgun. I think it's John Wick. He's got a shotgun, and he's, you know, using his shotgun. And each time he racks the slide, you can hear the slide rack super clearly and forward in your face on the processor, the separates processor, and the shell you hear hitting the floor on the separates processor. But on the MRX 1140 receiver, sometimes you don't even hear the shell hitting the floor, right? Like a regular projectile, like for munitions, like a bullet or something like that, like you can hear it, but it's not as, it's kind of faint sounding. But like a shell has a little bit more, I would say, distinct quality to it. And it's not as sharp sounding. It's kind of, it's just, you know what I mean? It's like a slightly deeper, more, you know what I mean? Like it's just, it's a different sound, right? So if the DACs and the circuitry and everything aren't up to snuff, it can't really put that sound completely in your face. Whereas like the Anthem AVM 90 does a great job by letting you hear everything. You hear the projectiles from everybody firing their weapons with the AVM 90. Whereas like the receiver, you hear some of it, you know what I mean, but you don't really hear all of it, type of deal, right? As far as bass quality, now some people say the bass is not really that much of a difference. I would say I beg to differ, right? Because I feel like with the separates, at least the 1140 versus the AVM 90, and this is with me using 2 subwoofer outs on both. The AVM 90, which is a separates processor, has 4 subwoofer outs. I'm only using 2, and then the MRX 1140 has the 2 subwoofer outs, right? So I'm only using 2 on each. I feel like the bass is a little bit more articulate with the AVM 90 than it is the 1140. The 1140, the bass is really good, right? It's not bad. You know, it's using Arc Genesis. It's not bad at all. You know, I think I bumped it up like to deep bass boost, I think like 3 or 4, like, but it's not bad. You know what I mean? Like it's really good, like on the 1140. But the AVM 90, I don't know if it is because the processor can process sounds a lot better, you know what I mean, and reproduce them a lot better. Maybe the bass is also impacted, but I feel like when I'm watching Dune, you know, Dune 2 or Dune 1, I feel like the bass is more articulate, you know what I mean, and it's more, you know, it's cohesive with everything else that's going on in the track with the AVM 90 separates processor, you know. So that's my opinion on it. Now, if you have a budget, is it really worth getting a separates processor? It depends on your hearing. Some people, you know, you just want to have the best, you know, and some people you may not be able to hear certain things. A lot of people may be older, may, you know, starting to have forms of hearing loss and things like that. May not really be worth it, right? But if you have pretty decent hearing and you want to hear everything, you know, the separates processor could be the way to go. If you have the room, if your room is already treated, you know, and you know which amps you want to go with, you know, so it's going to depend on you as a consumer. But my personal opinion, now that I've gone to separates processors, it's, you know, or a separates processor, it makes me not really want to listen to a receiver that much. Like if I'm, so like sometimes I want to rewatch a movie, right? I might be with the family or whatever, and, you know, I just want to go in the house, you know, watch a movie and not be out in my main, like, You know what I'm saying? My shed thing with my, you know what I mean, my AVM 90 and all of that stuff in there, like just everything tailored towards me with all of my speakers and everything. If I want to go into the theater in the house and I'm watching something that I've watched before, I notice now that there are sounds that are either really subdued on the receiver or not present on the receiver. So psychologically, it's like, man, I might need to get another processor. You know what I mean? Like, because now I know the difference, you know. But, you know, if you're not like that, if you're not really particular about things, it's not really a big deal, you know. But there's definitely a difference. Another thing is if you're running your audio at reference, right? So let's just say, I think on the Anthem, it may be -14. I asked them, I think they said -15 dB is reference, -10 or -15. I think they said -15, right? So if you're running it at reference, right, and it's loud, it's, you know, impactful, it's, you know, it's gonna sound really good on the receiver, especially an Anthem. It's gonna sound good, right? Cinematic, like really good, right? But if you run it at reference on a separates processor, an Anthem separates processor, you're gonna hear everything loud and clear, right? It's like loud and distinct. So all the 7 layers, you hear all 7 loud, right? And with no distortion, you know, whereas like the Anthem receiver, everything's loud, right? But you may not hear all 7 layers clearly. You may hear maybe 5 clearly, and 2 might be, you know, not as clear, you know what I mean? Or maybe inaudible at times, you know, or like if you got a Marantz Cinema 50, if I'm even looking at my Anthem AVM 90 and I'm rating it versus the Cinema 50 that I had a Marantz, Marantz isn't as good as an Anthem in my opinion. You know, so like it doesn't separate sounds as good as the Anthem receiver. You know, the Anthem Cinema 50, the Marantz Cinema 50 receiver doesn't separate sounds as good as the Anthem receiver. So it's like the AVM 90, it's like a complete difference, you know, when you're running a separates versus a Cinema 50, right? Or even with the Anthem AVM 90 separates versus the 1140, it's a difference. One is super clear. You know what I mean? And then another one's more cinematic and the sounds are a little bit, you know, compressed in a little bit, it sounds like. You know, so it just depends on what you like, you know. And then one thing I do like about separates versus a receiver, right, is that with separates, let's just say I want to change the sound signature or the tonality of my processor, right? Instead of having to buy another processor, I could just buy different amps, you know? I could do that. Or let's just say down the line, because I heard that they're coming out with, I don't want to ruin it because somebody told me in confidence what they're coming out with, you know, with a company at Audio Advice Live. But let's just say they come out with another processor a couple years from now, right? I could just replace the processor and I don't have to worry about replacing the amps if I like the amp sound signature. Because amps can last you like 10 years plus. You know, so it's like it's positive and negatives with the processor, but it's, you know, it leans more, in my opinion, towards positives in the in-game aspect to where you don't have to just replace everything. Whereas like, you know, my Anthem 1140 receiver was $4,200. Now, if they come out with another Anthem receiver in a few years or whatever, and I want to change it, I'm out of that money. You know, I have to try to figure out how to sell that and then get a whole new one. You know, whereas if I would have just had, like, instead of getting that, I probably should have gotten an AVM 70, right? And just invested a little bit of money in the amps. Then I could just choose to replace the processor if I wanted to. But Anthem is so good, you know, even if they came out with new processors, you're going to be fine for probably 10 years. That's how good these things sound. You know, it's not like a Denon or like a Yamaha or like a Marantz to where it's like, I kind of really do want to just try the new one. Like those things are like so far superior in sound quality to me because of what they use from room calibration. I just, you know, I'm fine. I could be fine with an Anthem for like 7 more years, you know, and be completely fine. Now, another thing comes down to it, right? When people think about separates versus receivers, you have to think about what calibration you're using, right? So maybe you think you should be moving to separates because you're not hearing things that you believe you should be hearing. Like maybe you have a Denon or Marantz, you're not getting mid bass. You feel like there's, you know, the sound is not as holographic as you would like. It's a little bit too directional. It just may not be super good, right? Maybe you have Odyssey XT, you may not like it. Maybe instead of moving to a separates processor, maybe you need to try Direct Live. Maybe you just need to pay the money to download Direct Live so you can get the separation of sounds. Because like with my Onkyo RZ50 that's in the house, you could either run it like with just the Onkyo RZ50 or you can use the Direct Live that's in it, you know. And when I utilized the Direct Live that was in it, it brought a lot of separation and sounds out. So you might not even need, you know, like a separates processor because just that jump to Direct Live from Odyssey XT may just be so big to you. You can be happy with your receiver for an additional maybe 2 to 3 years, you know, just off of making that initial investment into Direct Live. You know, so you don't always have to jump to something drastic. You can just do incremental upgrades and sometimes be happy with that. You know, so that's my opinion. I do feel like separates is better, but it's also going to depend. And sometimes, like, if I'm watching a movie, too, this is going to sound interesting. Like, if I'm watching a movie, I may not want the movie to be super clear, right? Sometimes you do want to hear the cinematic approach to sound, right? Whereas like a receiver is going to sound more cinematic. You know, the Anthem AV 1140 is going to sound more cinematic than a separate processor by Anthem, which is the AVM 90. Is sometimes too clear, right? And it's so clear it's distracting because if somebody's moving in a chair, you hear everything like on the chair moving. It's not just a person moving. You hear the cushion. You hear the maybe the hydraulic mechanism on the chair moving. You hear everything. You know, you hear the sides. You hear just like this. You know what I mean? Like pushed forward, like on the processor. Whereas like you may not want to be distracted by all of that going on in the movie. And sometimes it's cool. You want to hear everything, but sometimes you just want to watch the movie. Right. And then that's sometimes a receiver could be better at that. You know what I mean? And just depending on how you feel. Now, if you feel like I want to hear my system to do it, hear every little thing. I'm watching a horror movie. I want to hear everything. Then, you know, the processor can come into play. You know what I mean? So it just depends on what you want. You know what I'm saying? But y'all tell me what y'all think down in the comment section below. Comment, rate, subscribe. Let me know what y'all think about that. I've been doing a lot of trade shows. You know, I just went to Audio Advice Live. It's my second year going to that. I went to Expoda this year. Going to Cedia. You know, I go to, you know, a lot of different trade shows and everything. But, you know, it's one thing experiencing things in a trade show, and it's another thing experiencing things in home, you know? So get yourself a good dealer, you know, and see if they will allow you to try out different products in your home to see what works best for you, you know? So I don't know. Y'all tell me what y'all think down in the comment section below. I'm not affiliated with anybody. These are my real opinions, you know, and we're going to move on to the next topic. I'm out. Comment, rate, subscribe. Let me know what y'all think about that. Peace.